Well, if you have a Bible or a way to access your Bible, we will be in Luke chapter 2 again today. And if you haven't been here the last couple of weeks, you can see the titles of our messages all through this series we're calling The First Christmas. 2 weeks ago, we told the story of the journey of Mary and Joseph as they would leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem. And we called that Dealing with the Inconvenient. I mean, you can just imagine how challenging that trip would have been. And then last week we talked about when they were in the field and they saw the angels, and the angels heard the message, and we call that As Told by the Angels. But today we're going to hear the other side of this story, the people who heard that message and what they did with it. I'm calling today's message Good News Even for the Down and Lowly. And actually one of the things that we're going to read this morning that's really sort of surprising is that if we were to think about who God would have given that very first message to, the greatest story ever told, we might have imagined that he would have spoken it to princes in their palaces, Caesars in their capitals, but we would have never expected that it would be shepherds in a field. It's hard for us to understand shepherds in our modern world because when we read the Bible, there's so many different shepherds, and sometimes they're good and sometimes we're not sure what they are. But in the culture of Jesus' day, we know that the Jewish attitude towards shepherds was not a good one. In fact, in the Jewish writings of the period, they lumped shepherds right in there with all the other outcasts and sinners. And if you kind of think about it, it makes sense because shepherds lived outside, and they spent all their time with animals that lived outside. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like to always be around lots of animals that are outside, and I especially don't like to be around people who live with animals that are outside. There's just something about that just kind of strikes us as strange. And it seems that was a part of what's happening in this story, a part of what's happening in this culture that we would have never expected that the God of heaven would come and bring that message to these individuals. This good news, even for the down and lowly. We pick up in verse 15. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." And so they hurried off, and they found Mary and Joseph, and the baby was lying in the manger. And when they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things, and she pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. The good news came to the down and lowly. I think maybe this is hard for us to understand maybe in our culture today because of how we perceive ourselves. We tend to see ourselves as being maybe not the best people, but better than the worst. Maybe even good people. Every few years, I dust off an old story around Christmas time, and I tell it, and one of my favorite ones is the kid that wrote a letter to Santa. And he said, "Dear Santa, there are 3 little boys who live in our house. There's Jeffrey, he's 2. There's David, he's 4. There's Norman, he's 7. Jeffrey is good some of the time. David is good some of the time. But Norman is good all of the time. I am Norman." There's a sense of that in our world today, isn't there? Maybe you're one of those people today, you come here and you go, I'm a Norman. And so we're surprised that God would choose to reveal himself to a person who is down and low. I want you to see today how these shepherds are the first. They're the first of many things, but one is that they're the first to hear of the birth of Jesus. They're the first to hear of the story of Christmas. They're the first people on earth to hear about it outside of Mary and Joseph. It's really incredible to think about that. God chose to make them the first to hear this story. Now, we're told in the Bible that for centuries, the people of God had seen some significance to this town where this child was born, Bethlehem. And that there were stories about, hey, the next king is going to get born in Bethlehem. And they had remembered how 1,000 years earlier that this little backwater town of Bethlehem that nobody even knew about had been the birthplace of the greatest king in Israel's history. Of course, I'm talking about King David. But in the time of David, as well as in the time of Jesus, this was still a backwater, unimportant town. Nobody knew anybody who was from Bethlehem. You know, I can relate to this because I grew up in a small town. Anybody here grow up in a small town? Yeah, anybody from Waxahachie, you know? Just depends on, if you're from New York, you're kind of like, yeah, that's a small town. But I grew up in a small town. I grew up in a little town of 1,000 people in East Texas, 1,200 people to be exact. A lot of people I meet, I'll ask them, hey, do you know where, Big Sandy, that's where I'm from. And people will kind of look at me and they'll go, no, I don't know. Well, wait a minute. If they're old enough, they'll say, wait a minute. I remember Big Sandy. Wasn't Big Sandy that town that had that great football program? And wasn't there this guy named David Overstreet that had played football there and went on into the NFL and died in a tragic accident? And they will remember the little town that I'm from because of some notable figure that had emerged from there, right? Well, this is the only reason anybody knew about Bethlehem. Nobody said, I want to go to Bethlehem for summer vacation. It just wasn't an important place. But the prophet had said this in Micah 5:2, but you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. And these shepherds were the first to hear this thing become true. But they weren't just the first to hear it, they were also the first to see. Now, I don't mean the first to see like the angels telling the story. I mean, they were the first ones to confirm whether or not it was true. Was he really born in Bethlehem? Was he really in swaddling clothes? Was he really with Mary and Joseph? And they're the first to go and to look for and search and find the baby. But if you know your Bible very well, you know that they weren't the only ones that did this. In fact, if you were to take Luke's gospel and this great story of these shepherds going to look for Jesus, and then you were to take Matthew's gospel, you would see that both of them have a story of people who are going to find this baby. But the stories are a little different in terms of what they're trying to do. So let me just read to you real quickly and show you Matthew's story. Remember Matthew chapter 2 where there are those men from the east? We used to call them the wise men, the wise guys. That's really not a correct translation. That word magoi in Greek is magi. They are the students of the sky. They're the scholars of the stars. They spent their time studying the heavens because, like all ancient people, they believed that the sky revealed the plans of God for now and for the future. And by studying them, they could understand what God wanted them to see. And they had been studying them, and they become convinced that a king was born in the land of Judea. And we read about it in Matthew chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Notice they went to Jerusalem, the capital of Judea. They didn't go to Bethlehem. We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to what? To worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he'd called together all the peoples and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and he asked them, hey, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. And they quote the verse I just read to you from Micah 5:2, that it's going to be in Bethlehem. Then Herod called the Magi secretly. He said, hey guys, come over here. I got something I want to tell you. And he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem, and he said, go and search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report him to me, so that I too may go and worship him. But that's not what he was going to do, was it? And after they heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed, and coming to the house, they saw the child. It's not just the shepherds, it's the Magi. They saw the child with Mary, with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. And they opened their treasures and they presented him with gifts. And everybody remembers frankincense and myrrh, but also the gifts of gold. And since there were 3 gifts, we always say 3 wise men. We don't know how many there were. But it's interesting here, you have 2 different stories. You have, first of all, the shepherds who are there on a quest to find out if the story is true. And maybe this morning as you come to church, you're kind of like the shepherds. Maybe you came here today because you're just kind of trying to find out, is this story really legitimate? Is this a true story? And you're on a quest to find the truth and the reality of the baby in the manger. But then there's another story. It's these Magi who come. And they come not to see if the child exists or if the child was born. They come ready. They come prepared. They come with their offerings to present to him because they already believe that he's been born. And they're going to bring him these very precious and special gifts. The poet thought about these 2 stories when he wrote this famous poem that became a hymn. What can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would bring him a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. Yet what can I give him? Oh, I know. I'll give him my heart. As we come to the Christ of Christmas, as we come to the first Christmas, what are you seeking for today? Do you need the confirmation that this story is true? Or have you come here today knowing it's true and you've come prepared, you're ready to offer him your heart, you're ready to offer him your life? Now, I could kind of stop right here and fold up my Bible and go on and say, well, that was a good message. And for a lot of people, that is the Christmas story. But do you know if that's the end of the story, then that would be called the greatest story never told. Because the shepherds would know about it, and the Magi would know about it, but nobody else would know about it. Because what happens next is what happens in verses 17 and 18. Look what it says. It says, and when they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. They're not just the first to hear. They're not just the first to see. They are the first to tell the story of Christmas. They're the first ones to tell anybody about what's happened. And God has chosen them to be the ones to do all of that. Let me ask you a question this morning. How should we respond to this story? Well, I think we ought to respond the way they did. We see here in verse 17 that they spread the word. There's a song we sometimes sing at Christmas time. We sing, "Go tell it on the mountain." And you remember the kid that went to church and she came home, she was 3 years old, and she said, at church today we learned about how Jesus was on the mountain with goats at Christmas time. Because she got it all mixed up, goats tell it on the mountain, you know. You can sing that on your way home from church today. Go tell it on the mountain. Tell everybody the good news about who Jesus is. Spread the word. I was thinking about that this week, and you take that little 3-year-old child and you realize something's really true. It is hard for a child to really understand the Christmas story. It really is hard for a child to understand. They get all those little things confused, goes and goats and, peas and peace and all that kind of stuff. They get it all mixed up. But you know what's really easy for a child? Is to take that good news and tell other people about it. Now flip that upside down and talk about an adult for a moment. You know what's easy for an adult? To understand this story. Even as I explained it to you, you understand what's going on in this story. But you know what's hard? Go tell somebody about it. Go tell it on the mountain. Go tell it to your neighbor. Go tell it to your friend. Go tell it to somebody right now that you know that needs to hear it. And you'll discover it's not easy. It's easy to get it. It's easy to understand it, but it is hard to tell it. Why did the God of heaven reveal this to shepherds in a field? Because he knew they would tell it. They wouldn't just see it. They wouldn't just hear it. They would tell it. This Christmas, you as an American are probably going to fit into one of these statistics. 68% of us are going to open presents. Check. 61% of us are going to visit family or friends. Check. 31% of us are going to watch a football game. In Texas, I bet the numbers are a lot higher than that. 15% of us are going to start a fire in a fireplace. 10% are going to leave food out for Santa. 4% are going to stay sick in bed alone. 2% are going to go caroling. And 39% are going to attend church. Can I just tell you something? That's easy. Those things are easy. You may say, oh, that's kind of hard. No, those things are actually easy. What is hard is to spread the word. Now, it says here that they didn't just go and say, hey, guys, guess what we saw last night? We saw some angels in a field and a miraculous baby that's the king of the world. It's going to save everybody. That's not what they did, is it? The text tells us in verse 18 that they spread it and people were amazed at what they overheard. There was a sense of, wow, this is really true. This is really amazing. They amazed their hearers. I believe in amazing grace. I believe the gospel is still amazing. And I believe that when people hear it and experience it for the first time, their lives are changed and transformed. It's still amazing. And I think it's a tragedy when we keep that really good message all to ourselves. You know, every few years, you're a preacher and you preach Christmas sermons. You think back to one that just, a sermon or a story that just stood out to you. And years ago, I told the story of a guy named Luigi, I think his name right here, it was a long time ago, Luigi Tarisio. And he was a rare music art collector. When he died, they went into the attic of his house and they found exquisite instruments, some of the rarest stringed instruments in the world. You saw the violin today up here. He had a bunch of those. And among them were the most rare instrument in the world, the Stradivarius. And they discovered in one of the old rickety bureaus the most rare of all of the Stradivarius violins. And when they took it out, they discovered something else. They discovered that this rare instrument, the finest of its kind in the entire world, to play the most beautiful music that any violin could ever play, had not been played in 147 years. And there's a sudden sense of tragedy about it, that the world has missed out, has been stolen from them the gift of listening to this beautiful instrument performed and played for 147 years, because one guy said, I love violins, I love that instrument, I'm just going to hold on to it, I'm going to keep it, I'm going to stick it in an attic somewhere, and nobody's ever going to touch it. And you know what? There's a lot of people that do that with the story I just told you this morning, the good news. Oh man, I love Christmas. I love Jesus. I love the Bible. I love Christianity. And they take that wonderful treasure and they put it inside their heart and they lock it up. And they never tell anybody about it. I mean, Christmas comes and Christmas goes, and Easter comes and Easter goes, and they never open their mouth to anybody about the good news that's changed their lives. The good news that we're reading about here, that the shepherds received, was not just good news for them. It's good news for you and good news for me. They spread the word. They amazed their hearers with what they said. And then look what it afterwards, and I don't know about you, but when I read this verse, I just imagine these shepherds are just kind of skipping along. Have you ever just been real happy and you're just skipping along? It doesn't say that in the Bible. That's a little, extra. But in verse 20, it says, the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen. I just picture them jumping up in the air, their feet and sandals clicking together, which were just as they had been told. The first to tell. They spread the word, they amazed their hearers, they glorified the Lord. Good news, even for the down and lowly.